Japanese explained by Shashwat. First off, classification. The Japanese language is classified under the Japonic family, also called the Japanese Ryukyuan family, because it also contains the Ryukyuan languages. Japanese and Ryukyuan, there really aren't any other languages within the Japonic family. However, the two languages, Japanese and the Ryukyuan languages, they do have a lot of dialects. Now, there's currently ongoing debate over whether or not the Japonic family is related to the Korean language family, but as of now, it's presumed none. So currently, the Japonic languages are basically on their own, not related to any others. Writing systems. Now, sometimes the Chinese characters are used in the form of kanji. Now, kanji, it has a lot of characters being based in Chinese, well over 50,000 in fact. However, most of these are obsolete or archaic, so they're not really used. But even so, the 2,000 to 3,000 that are still being used in mainland Japan is still a lot. So there are also kana scripts, consisting of hiragana and katakana. There's also man-yoga, but that one isn't used very commonly. Hiragana and katakana, the two main kana scripts, are much simpler than kanji, as you can tell from this picture, so they're used a lot more often. Kanji is used much less often than the other kana scripts. However, the kana scripts aren't used just for Japanese, but also for the language of Ainu in northern Japan, which at this point is very little. At this point, it's almost dead, with only 15,000 native speakers left. The kana scripts are also used in Palau, the tiny island, which was seized by Japan from Germany in World War I. And so while that happened, some Japanese settlers went there, and Japanese is still actually being used as a language in one or two districts of Palau. But Palau used to be part of Japan until World War II, when the US seized them from Japan. Grammar. Japanese is an agglutinative language, meaning that many words are formed by taking smaller root words and combining them together. Japanese also uses a pure vowel system, meaning that the vowels are essentially the same start to finish, like oo, ah, ooh, ah, that sort of thing. Japanese also has a word order of subject, object, verb, where the subject, object, and verb come in that order, which this chart nicely explains. In English, we have an order of subject, verb, object, I love New York, but in Japanese, it's subject, object, verb, I, New York, love. This pattern of word organization is common in other languages, such as Sanskrit, Hindi, ancient Greek, Latin, and many more. Many more, actually. History. Back in the early 2nd century BC, settlers came from either the mainland Asia or from some Pacific islands. However, there was no real writing system for Japanese at this time, so we know very little about what was going on at this time. It wasn't until the spread of Buddhism that the Chinese writing system was brought into Japan and formed the basis for kanji. The earliest Japanese text, in fact, is the Kojiki from the 8th century, which was written entirely in Chinese characters. If you move forward quite a bit, you eventually reach early Middle Japanese, which arrived with the Heian period from 794 to 1185. There was large amounts of Chinese influence on the language at the time, but it was also at this time two new kana scripts emerged, hiragana and katakana. 500 years later, you would eventually reach late Middle Japanese, which shedded many of its archaic features and became much more similar to modern Japanese. It was also at this time the first loanwords from European languages came into Japan, mainly from Portuguese missionaries, who gave such words as pan, who gave such word as pao for bread, which eventually became pan in Japanese. They also gave tabako, which means which back then meant cigarette, but nowadays tobacco in general. Finally, we reach modern Japanese, which started in the 17th century with the Edo period, also called the Tokugawa, due to the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was started by that guy. With this Edo period, prior to the Edo period, the standard de facto dialect was the dialect around Kyoto, which translates into capital city. Kyoto was the capital city where the emperor lived and one of the largest cities, and as a result, that was the dialect around there was used as the standard. However, at the time, the standard dialect shifted towards Tokyo, which translates as Eastern Capital, the place where the shogun and his samurai resided in. Tokyo also happened to be growing very, very strong at this time. With the end of Japan's self-imposed isolation in 1853, the number of European loanwords increased dramatically. That number went even higher for words from English in 1945, especially with technology, mainly TVs, computers, that sort of thing. Japanese words in English. Here I'm going to be looking into some of the Japanese words that have entered the English language and provide some rules and things to know about such words, as well as any exceptions to the rules I mentioned. First off, as I'm sure you are aware, Japanese uses a different writing system than English, meaning words have to be transliterated as they cross over, and a large part of their spellings can be figured out based on their sounds. After all, many of those words were spelled out when they were written in English characters. Only about 300 Japanese words have entered English, relatively small compared to other language, but the number of words entering English is likely to increase, especially with how things are going with the much friendlier relations with the US and Japan than in the past. Things are pretty simple with O, the O sound as in boat, just spelled with an O. Same thing with U, just spelled with a U. I, however, isn't spelled with the letter it makes, it's spelled with an AI. For example, samurai. Of course, the exception to this rule would be Tobira, which uses an I instead of an AI. Another thing is that for E, the E sound along E mainly uses an I. Every once in a while you'll get an E, like in karate and karaoke, but that's relatively rare. I is overwhelmingly more common, but some exceptions to both of these letters include Suji, Shiki, Netsuki. Yes, the Netsuke is pronounced Netsuki, and Ryukyu. Another thing is with the A sound, which is spelled with an EI. Once in a while there's an E, but that's once again very rare. This EI spelling also pops up often within the suffix se for generation, which pops up in such words as isei, nisei, sansei. Once again, that E pops up every once in a while, but very rarely. For the cut sound, it's overwhelmingly a K. Once in a while you'll get a C, but while it's not exactly rare, it only pops up in 38 words, while K comes up 107 times. And when you take into account that there's only 300 words that went from Japanese to English, that means that over 1/3 of the Japanese words in English have a K. J and G are extremely simple. They're both spelled how they sound, a J being used for a J, always, and a G being used for G, always. There's basically no exceptions to this rule, except for one that you'll see later. Also, sa is once again spelled with an S. Once in a while, you'll find a TS being used, but there's only 4 words you'll find them in. Subo and Suga you might not have heard of, but tsunami, if you know anything about earthquakes or possibly tsunami is more common. You should know that one. But there's also Susugamushi disease, which has 2 cases of TS. Also, one major thing, Japanese has very, very few cases of doubled letters. There's only 12 words that have doubled letters. That's so few, I can list them all here. There you go. They're Hoku, Issei. In Issei you can see that sei root word meaning generation. That's why it has double S. Also Mami, Seppuku, Shiki, Shikin, Skibi, Suji, Tenno, Teppanyaki, Tori, and Tycoon. So I said earlier that there were a couple that had double K. Those would be Hoku, Shiki, and Shikin, which is formed from a variation of Shiki. So Hoku, Shiki, Shikin. Those are the ones to remember that use double K. Other than that, the K is always spelled with a K or a C. Also, if you look at Tori, this is an exception to the E equals I rule. It uses a double I. Also, something I would like to point out, Suji, for breaking essentially every rule I've said so far. Not only does it have a case of doubled letters, it has 2 cases of doubled letters. Also, the G in Suji is being used to make the J sound, rather than a G sound, which breaks another rule. Also, rather than using a U for an U, it uses OO, and rather than using an I for E, it uses EE. Suji is special for breaking basically every rule I've said so far. Other than that, Japanese is rather simplistic and minimalistic, which is nice. They stick to their rules. So that's about it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned quite a bit. I know I learned quite a bit while researching this video. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.